Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Corrupt Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 2008 sports drama biopic titled The Express. Now, The Express runs for 2 hours and 10 minutes long. It is directed by Gary Fleeter. It is produced by John Davis. The script was written by Charles Levitt. And it is actually based on a novel titled The Elmira Express, the Ernie Davis story, by Robert C. Gallagher. The score was done by Mark Isham, the cinematography by Kramer Morgenthau, and the editing was done by Pedrak McKinley and William Steinkamp. And the stars of the movie are Rob Brown, Dennis Quaid, Charles S. Dutton. Let's see what else is there. We have Darrin, Dewitt-Henson, Nelsan, Ellis, Clancy Brown, Saul Rubinek, Anjanou Ellis. I think I pronounced her name right. If I didn't, I sincerely apologize. And Nicole Dehaire. So The Express definitely takes its rightful spot in the annals of the ever-so-growing sports drama of one individual having to break barriers and impossible odds only to come out on top in the end. We've seen a lot of stories about breaking color barrier, breaking gender barriers, and breaking barriers in terms of somebody who has done the impossible odds or who has conquered those who thought that the obstacles placed in front of them was redeemably impossible and never been done before. I always dig these kind of movies. And I digged The Express very well. Sure, it's part of the same category of other classic sports films like Remember the Titans, Glory Road, and Pride. And we could say that is something that we have all seen before, and you know what's coming next. Sure, it's as predictable as it is, but sometimes these predictable, done-to-death stories can often be inspirational, and it could lift your spirits up. And if it could lift your spirits up, that means that this movie is truly doing its job. Not to sound kind of dull-minded, but The Express does focus primarily on one individual by contrast to the team. Now, of course, you know, in movies like football, it's usually based on a team thing. But this movie is focusing only entirely on, well, not entirely, but mostly on one specific individual. This is definitely a biopic of one guy who is not a household name, like in the same sense as Jesse Owens or Jackie Robinson or Jack Jefferson. What's with all these African Americans who break barriers? Why do their names all start with the letter J? Ironic. Okay, fine. Willie O.D., who broke the color barrier in hockey, his name doesn't start with J. So it's not cliché. It's just irony. So not to sound dull-minded, but The Express focuses primarily on one individual by contrast to the team. The film concentrates on the triumphs and the hardships college athletes of African American extraction had to endure as they opened unlocked doors and opened minds. And in the case of The Express, which tells the story of the Elmira Express himself, Ernie Davis, this is the story of a man who had to go through incredible lengths to help, to help bring up the spirits of the Syracuse Orangemen on their triumphs to exceptional fame. But aside from that, he also made history by being the first African American to win the Heisman Trophy. So though dependent on superficial Hollywood dramatization, The Express conveys an insightful look into how African Americans struggled to be noticed, and even more focus on being accepted. Even though it sparks realism in storytelling, it still has this fabricated hyperbole in terms of its execution. Yes, I know what you're all thinking. This is based on a true story. This is a biopic, so we're all led to believe that everything that you see in a biopic or biographical movie has to be real. But I think the only way you can actually make it justifiable that it really did happen, you probably may have to live the moment. So we don't actually know if every event that was depicted here was true or not. There is a lot of exaggeration. But because this is a movie and not a documentary, we just have to take it like a grain of salt and make a rational belief that these things really did happen. But it's not 100% confirmed because, like I said, you have to live the moment. I mean, you would have to be these people, not just actors pretending to be these people. And from what I've read, there were probably a lot of things in there that were exaggerated. So the structure really does defy routine, and the emotional stirrings emanates really by the 90-minute mark, all the while leaking out an overlong diatribe about why our central character hardly ever gets the credit like his teammate and friend Jim Brown. Well, obviously, Ernie Davis lived a very short life. And, it was actually a pretty inspiring life that Ernie Davis had. Some people can live out their lives. They can live till their 70s, their 80s, their 90s. They can even push as a centurion. And yet they've never had a fulfilled life. They just drift away. They just drift on. They just linger on. But Ernie Davis, even though, yes, it was sad that he died at only the young age of 23 years old, but in that short life that he had, he made the most out of it. And yes, he had to go through the trials and tribulations of being accepted in society because of the fact that his skin tone is a little darker than the average American back in the 50s and 60s. And that he had to jump further hurdles to get noticed. And he had to battle the race game. Even though, hey, in the 50s and 60s, there were black football players, they didn't make up the majority. I mean, today, if you look at the NFL, when you look at the ethnic race demographics, the race demographics is about 70 to 75% of the football players in the NFL are predominantly African American. Basketball makes up about 85 to 90%. Football makes up to about 70 to 70%. And then you have track and field. Baseball makes up about maybe 10 to 15%. Hockey, if you're lucky, maybe 5%. Maybe even that might probably be a stretch. Soccer may make up about 15 to 20%. But yeah. But back in the 50s, football was still predominantly Caucasian. And college football did not really have that many African Americans in the sport. Because, even back in the 50s and 60s, very few African Americans attended university. And, it had to take, of course, this movie does have a little bit of a nod to the civil rights suit in the 60s, that kind of like is around the time of, protesters or peacemakers like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King trying to make their statement across. Ernie Davis could be a symbolic metaphor in that kind of category, where instead of radicalism or peace marching, he is showing civil rights inspiration through the art of sport. Not through word of dialogue, not through word of violence or anything like that, but through hard work, dedication to the sport, and perseverance. This is his way of spreading the message across. And if you could spread the message across in that way, that is truly inspirational. Ernie Davis is an unsung hero. And even, from his death in 1963, we had, of course, President John F. Kennedy giving tons of praise from him. That he is an icon and a staple in the field of professional football. He opened territories. So our story proceeds around the year 1959-1960 in Texas during the Cotton Bowl, as the Syracuse Orangemen are up against the all-famous Texas Longhorns. The star halfback and our central character is Ernie Davis, played by Rob Brown. He is one of 3 black guys on the Syracuse team. Ernie must fend off against a biased crowd while overcoming racial taunts and, general cold shoulder among teammates, among the University of Syracuse, their classmates who kind of, dismissed him. He had to sort of overcome that. And as he is at the line of scrimmage, his mind wanders into flashbacks to his youth, growing up in Pittsburgh, up to his recruitment of Coach Ben Schwartzwalder, played by Dennis Quaid, and his team to an undefeated season. Up until before Ernie Davis came on, the Syracuse team, the Orangemen, were really not that good. It was until they recruited Ernie Davis that the team started to get better. Yes, he wasn't fully accepted in. He was persuaded to join Syracuse University because Schwartzwalder didn't really know how to approach Ernie Davis, so he had to get former Syracuse Orangeman Jim Brown to bring Davis into the Syracuse team. And, there was some friction. I mean, because Jim Brown used to wear the number 44, they decided that, hey, I guess 44 is a number for a black guy, so they gave the number 44 to Ernie Davis. And, of course, this was much to his chagrin. I mean, probably would have been more better to be another number, but he thought that, hey, pass one shirt to a black guy to give to another black guy. And that's kind of like what happened there. So, there was a little bit of some racial tension there between Schwartzwalder and Davis. But, as time went on, they started to grow onto each other, from being, just this cranky coach to a more likable, caring individual. but we'll get a little bit more into character detail as we go along. So football is definitely the symbolic meaning of life here in the Express. Ernie's emotional stages seem to be synonymous with the United States in their quest for civil rights and equality amongst African Americans, where segregation should be expunged, apartheid should be vanquished, and that all nations, colors, creeds, religions, orientations should all be united as a member, not the American race, but of the human race. Everybody should be united as one, and no one should ever be treated as inferior or insignificant. It's really refreshing that the racial integrity, the racial ignorance, and the cold shoulders, especially when he arrives in Syracuse's all-Caucasian campus. When Syracuse goes down south, the racism is welcomed with open arms, and how he had to sleep in different hotel rooms due to his skin color, or that, or if they do go into hotel rooms to collect their prizes and their trophies and their recognitions, all the Caucasians had to sit in the front and the black people all had to sit in the back, or they would have to go into all kinds of different rooms or different places, or not invited to certain areas because of their skin complexion. It sparks realism because that was kind of like the ideology back in the 60s. But, of course, there might even be some half-truths to full lies in that analogy as well. Like I said, you had to live the moment. I was born in 1976, so I don't know the whole story. I wasn't alive then. Or maybe I was. Maybe I was a different person. Maybe I wasn't always Eric Ryder. But that's a different story. It's not about me. I don't know. You have to live the moment. That's all I'm saying. Although Ernie Davis is the main character we follow here, there's a lot of intriguing character development in Coach Schwartzwalder himself. Coming from the fact that he was born in West Virginia, who had pretty much at first a disdain towards African Americans. In fact, at first when you first meet the guy, you think he's just some cantankerous, grouchy old curmudgeon coach who only cares about winning in championships and doesn't really care about the team, just as long as they could score touchdowns and have great field kicks and play to win. But then we realize that it's just another kind of cliche that you see in a lot in movies about students, about coaches learning from the students. Yes, sometimes it's actually quite inspiration to see a teacher learn from the students. And that, it doesn't always have to be this condescension that the teacher should know more about the student just because, they have all kinds of degrees and all kinds of trophies he's taped to their walls. And they have all kinds of things to prove that they are right, and that it's not always that case. Sometimes students can impress the teacher, and if you could find ways to impress the teacher, you are a real hero. This is not putting teachers down in any kind of way. Ernie Davis taught Schwartzwalder about the power of teamwork, and that there is no I in teamwork. There's a few A's and E's and O's, but if you spell out the word teamwork, is there any I in teamwork? I didn't think so. So, I thought it was kind of an inspirational story in itself. This is a very character-driven film. If you're intrigued by the character of Ernie Davis, you'll also be just as much as intrigued by the character of Ben Schwartzwalder, who also had some great exceptional fame. He was also a Hall of Famer in college sports, and he lived his life in the field of football up until his death in 1993. But soon we see a change of heart which eventually becomes sympathetic towards Ernie Davis. And he does learn that the landscape in American society and culture is starting to take its toll to becoming more acceptance for a person regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of their race and religion and their orientation and creed and stuff like that. You know? The 1960s was the potential stage of the age of existence. And here we are seeing that change. And we are reliving it. Though the acting overall wasn't really that spectacular, it's still very well in a much subtle manner. Rob Brown adds good charm and great intentions as the mild-mannered Elmira Express. His intensity definitely speaks volumes in his performance rather than words. I mean, the guy was pretty much overall a silent, mild-mannered, a man of a few words. But if you could just look into his eyes, if you could just look at his facial expressions, it paints a much better picture than words of mouth. And he pulls that off very, very well. This is something that could be Oscar caliber. Unfortunately, I guess because of the low budget and because it didn't sell well at the box office, because of all these historical inaccuracies, I guess, it was pulled off the shelves very soon before it ever really got the recognition that it truly deserved. So with the prejudicial abuse that surrounds his well-being, he was still able to utilize his eye movements to express his inner anger. Like I said, Dennis Quaid, who is the real veteran performer here, he excels better in this more supporting role, even though he seems to be playing a familiar role that we've seen him before. And, football and him have been pretty much synonymous over the past few years. He's been in sports-themed movies before, like Any Given Sunday and Everybody's All-American. Only here, he's actually playing a coach as opposed to a player. I guess that kind of makes sense. I mean, hey, come on. He's in his 50s. Well, at the time when this movie came out, he was in his 50s. If you check IMDb, he's actually 63 years old as we speak, but I guess back in 2008, he was pretty much in his 50s, so, of course he's not going to be up there in the gridiron. He's going to be playing more of a coach role. Other significant notables include Charles Dutton as Ernie's grandfather, Pops, a guy who sparked some inspiration and optimism through his role. So he did really, really well there. He was on for a limited time, but he did make a great difference in this role. Subtle, too limited, but he was very effective. And a great deal of respect goes to Darrin Dewitt-Henson as the football great Jim Brown, who was prominent in helping Ernie sign with Syracuse. Now, if I was to find any weaknesses in the story, okay. So outside the football scenarios, there are personal moments that happen in Ernie's life in this film, including his relationship with his grandfather and with his mother. If there was a weakness there, I would have liked to know a little bit more about that as well, because it sounded like some very intriguing things, but we don't get enough of that. And the love relationship between Ernie Davis and his love interest, Sarah Ward, played by Nicole Dehaire, it never really fully envelops. I mean, they appear as friends before they actually start to go into lovemaking, but there's no indication if they're just, like in a platonic relationship. We don't really know for sure if before, him and her decide to get it on, and of course it led to his nosebleed, which we eventually later find out was the earliest signs that something's not right in Dodge. His frequent nosebleeds and his dizziness, which eventually would lead to him being diagnosed with leukemia. We never really actually see too much development in him and his relationship with Sarah Ward. So we don't know whether they were just in a platonic relationship, engaged, or there's no real indication if they're even married. You know, maybe he married young. Well, some important scenes surrounding Ernie's life, which could have been a personal interest, was sadly edited out or just neglected. And that's kind of where the biggest weakness is. As a film about chasing your dreams and dodging racial bullets, The Express is the idol biopic. And while he did make history on the college level gridiron, it's his civil approach towards the racially enhanced environment that earns our admiration and is truly a worthy film to watch. So with all said and done, if I was to give this movie a scale out of 10, I would give The Express an 8.5. This is truly a great sports film. Even if you're not exactly a film of football, or if you're not a big fan of football, or you are not particularly interested in sports, the human drama inside is just as equally effective as the sports itself. But if you are a fan of football, there are a lot of great exciting scenes. Of course, you know, there's going to be a lot of exaggeration. There's going to be a lot of hyperbole depicted in the movie. But if you could just suspend your disbelief and just take it like a grain of salt and say, wow, if these things really did happen, this is some pretty amazing stuff. So I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening in. If you wish to subscribe to my channel, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, go right ahead. Just remember, be kind, be courteous, and don't be rude. And I will be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is our correct writer saying, keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.